Hello everyone, and welcome to Behind the Scenes here at MUNCH Museum. My name is Signe Endresen, and I am an art educator from the museum. So the museum is now closed to the public, but we're letting you in here behind the scenes to let you in on how we work here. And I'm lucky to be surrounded by very knowledgeable people here at the MUNCH Museum, and we're going to meet one of them today. We're going to meet the art historian, Signe Endresen. Hi everyone. Signe, thank you for being here with us.
So nice to be here.
So what exactly are we going to talk about today?
Today we're going to talk about Munch's series, and the largest of these, the Frieze of Life in particular.
Great. So you're going to hear very loud sounds right now, and these screens that we see behind us, we can't touch them. And Martin, our art technician, will be pulling out the screens here. So this is because we're in the painting storage, which is very exclusive. So we hope you enjoy all these different paintings here. So, Signe, what's going on here? The series.
Well, Munch painted different versions of his images, and he painted series. So versions are just different variations of the same motif, but a series is a collection of motifs that were intended to be viewed as together. So here we have a sketch for one of these series. This is probably for the Reinhardt frieze, and there's also something called the Linde frieze and the Green Room and Alpha and Omega. So there are many friezes or series that Munch created, the largest one being the Frieze of Life, of course.
Could you tell me more about the Frieze of Life?
Yes, but let's look at the Reinhardt frieze first.
Yes, let's do that.
Yes, because you can see here that Munch has created sketches for this frieze, and they are horizontal, band-like almost. And then you see there's the shoreline that unites all these images.
Yes.
In this sketches here, we can see some motifs that are more familiar to us, such as the lonely ones, the two humans that we see on the shoreline here. And then to the right here, the kiss, this time in the forest. And then on the bottom is something that looks like the Dance of Life.
Yes.
Also a very, very famous painting.
All right, so then I can ask you about the Frieze of Life.
Yes, because many of these, the most famous images that Munch painted, such as Scream, Kiss, The Dance of Life, and Melancholy,
yes,
and The Vampire, are part or considered part of the Frieze of Life. So it sort of encapsulates most of his most famous paintings are in the Frieze of Life.
So the Frieze of Life, it always seemed like a symphony to me. Is there a type of structure to it, and how does this storytelling go?
Well, the main themes are, there are different themes in the Frieze of Life, but the main themes are that of love and life. And it shows or chronicles the beginnings, the maturity, the decline, and then the death of love and life. And then it goes back to the beginnings again. So it's like a cycle, it's cyclical.
So we're now going to move over to a painting that has to do with this movement and the cyclical. But could you tell me about the interest of Munch in these series? Where did it begin?
Good question, because the themes probably started in the late 1880s, 1888, 89. But the idea of constructing series was not new in that late period of the 1800s. In Paris at the time, there was almost a flood of series created by artists, and Munch probably saw Monet's very famous exhibition of haystacks in 1891 in Paris. And we also have a series done by Courbet and Toulouse-Lautrec and Whistler as well.
So what is this painting's title, and is it a part of Frieze of Life?
Well, this is called Woman, and it was painted in 1925. But it is a later version of a painting from 1894 that was exhibited in Berlin in 1902 when he exhibited the Frieze of Life at one point. The Frieze of Life was exhibited at different times, first time in 1893 and then 1902 and 1918 also. So at different stages in his life.
So what exactly are we looking at here? What's going on here?
Well, we see three women and a man standing at the intersection of a forest and the shore. And this is something that we see a lot in Munch's paintings. We also saw it in the sketches that we saw just a minute ago. This shoreline and sort of with the woods here is something that we see very often in Munch's works. Here we see to the left a woman with a white dress and blonde hair, and she's looking out over the ocean and over towards the horizon. And she is very young looking. Her dress is very white and clean. It's almost like she is a little bit naive in life, and she's at the beginning of life. Very optimistic, maybe?
Yeah.
And then if we look at the woman in the middle, this woman has a little bit more reddish hair, and look at that smile.
It's a devious smile.
Yes, she is really communicating with us, and she has her arms behind her head, and she's nude and very frontal, and also placed in the middle of the composition, so central in the composition. And look at the brush strokes there, all the different colors, and the energy and liveliness of the brush strokes that we see here in this figure. Very different from the white dress that we saw just a moment ago.
Yes.
To the right there is a woman who's almost hidden by the shadows of the trees. And she is dressed in a dark dress. And look at that face, very different from the two others that we have looked at.
Very much.
She is looking very sorrowful almost. Dark hair, resigned almost, as she's given up almost in life.
Yeah.
And the dress also, the way it's depicted is flat and with just very plain horizontal strokes of the brush.
It looks almost stone-like.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. And then to the right behind the tree here is the man. And again, his face is very different as well, with the orange lines sort of making up his face.
Yeah.
Matisse-like almost.
Oh, yeah, that's
Maybe.
a very good point, yeah.
And he is also quite darkly dressed, standing at the edges here, and he is turned towards the edges of the painting, as if he is contemplating to leave. I don't know.
Oh, maybe.
Maybe.
But, okay, so we'll get back to this interesting male figure here. But could you tell me a bit about the female tropes of Edvard Munch, back to these ladies that we see here?
Well, yes. Well, in a way, you could say he's showing us the three different personalities of one woman, or it could be different personalities of different women. The the one woman dressed in the white dress is young, naive, innocent, optimistic. The woman in the middle being more sexually outgoing, more confident sort of type.
Dangerous even.
Maybe even dangerous, yes. And then the woman in the dark dress that's given up, depressed maybe.
Mourning?
We don't know. Mourning, yes. So these colors are sort of indicators of their types.
Now let's go back to this young man here. So would you say that this is Edvard Munch himself?
Oh. Well, it certainly looks a bit like Munch, the young Munch that we see in photographs from when he was 20 years old, 20-something. But remember that this painting was painted in 1925.
Yeah.
and Munch was an older man at this point.
True.
Yes, so this is not a self-portrait. This is a version of a man or an identity that he uses a lot in his paintings. And when you start seeing him in different paintings, you will see him a lot. Because this is a type of a man that Munch inserts in a lot of his paintings. This youngish, 20-something looking man.
So let's move back to this shoreline or the landscape that you spoke of earlier. Would you say that the landscape here has something to do with the woman's experience that is connected to that somehow?
Well, this shoreline is very reminiscent of Åsgårdstrand in a place where Munch had a house, a summer house. This wavy shoreline is something that we see a lot in his paintings. And the shoreline has a forest close to it. So, and this is also the area where Munch experienced his first very intense love. And they would go for walks in the forest and so on. So this is something that he uses a lot in his works.
Especially connected to the women that we see.
Yes, women and love.
Yes. So this format and this size, would you say that is quite typical of Edvard Munch's Frieze of Life, that he uses this size and format?
Well, Munch worked on this series for almost 50 years altogether. And sometimes he would sell off a painting and he would create a new version. And it was exhibited at different times. And so they're not all the same size. What Munch did was to mount them on fabric, high up on the wall. And then the paintings would be mounted up on top of that fabric. And in that way, they sort of blended a little bit more together, and that fabric, that band of fabric would also help with that. Like a classical frieze that you would see in a Greek temple. The frieze.
Interesting. All right, so Signe, thank you so much for sharing your expertise with us today.
Well, thank you for having me.
And thank you for following this behind the scenes at MUNCH Museum. We all hope that you enjoyed this, and we hope that you return soon again. Bye.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to this Q&A. My name is Signe Endresen, and I'm here to answer any questions that you might have about the film we just saw, or anything else really about Munch. I've been at the museum, at the MUNCH Museum, for a little more than 2 years right now. I can answer any art historical related questions I'll just start right off with answering your questions here. There's a question here from James from London. What is the first piece called? I'm not quite sure what you're relating to here, but the first piece in the video is a sketch for the Reinhardt frieze, probably. It is sort of a layout of what Munch has wanted the Reinhardt frieze to look like. And the paintings for that were installed in Reinhardt's theater in Berlin, and then later on dismantled and are now in a museum in Berlin. If you're relating to or asking about the first piece of the series, we don't really know, as Munch continually reworked his this Frieze of Life from 1893 and up into the 1930s. So he worked on it for a long time and exhibited at several different times. First time being in 1893, and then also in 1902 and 1918, which was the biggest exhibition. And as I mentioned in the video that you just saw, the series is cyclical, so that meaning that it doesn't really have a beginning or an end necessarily, and so we can't really say that there is one painting that is the first and one is the last. Please post your questions underneath if you, and feel free to ask about anything really. We have Sam from Boston. How many paintings are part of the Frieze of Life? Again, we don't really know what Munch meant was supposed to be the full Frieze of Life. As he exhibited this series at different times, and sometimes he would sell off a piece and then paint another version of the same image, and then use that for the series. And he also would add on to the series so that it's not a constant through the years. Starting out in 1893, it consisted of 6 paintings, and it was then called Die Liebe, or the Love series. And then in 1918, it had become a series of 20 paintings and 36 drawings and prints. So in a span of a few decades, it really changed a lot, this series. Let me see here. Patricia here from Belchertown. In the last piece, could the 3 women represent the same women in different stages of a relationship with Munch? Thank you for that. That's an interesting observation. Yeah, I indicate in the film that it could be 3 different types of women, or that it can be different aspects of the same woman, sort of like the different types within one woman. It could also, as you're indicating here, that maybe it is a way that Munch looks at women at different stages in a relationship. Good observation. Let me take another question. Anne-Marie from Whitehall is asking about about my dog friend behind me. This is Ziva. She is very comfortable with sleeping on the couch and listening to me talk. So thank you for noticing. We have one from Oslo here. What is the most interestingly features and similarities in the women? I'm assuming you're talking about the women in the painting, the last painting in the film. And that's a good question. Like I said, it's the color and the stance and the way the woman has been painted, or the different women, and the different differences between them, I think is the most interesting features, and sort of what they have in common. And also in Munch's other paintings, where he has this sort of 3 women, because this is not the only painting where this happens. We have the Dance of Life, that is a very famous painting, where he also sort of has these three colored women, the one in the white dress, and then the red dress in the middle, or sometimes she's nude, and then the dark dress. This is something we see very often, and it's quite striking when you see it.
And in that sense, I think that Munch is an artist that gives you clues, a lot of clues, and then repeats them so that you can sort of refine them or find them again in another painting, even if you haven't seen that painting before, which I think is something about Munch that is makes it a very nice experience, even though you haven't seen the painting before. And as I also mentioned a little bit, that with the man that we see in the painting is something that he inserts in a lot of different paintings, so you can see this man all over once you start noticing him. So this is something that Munch does, or something that's very helpful that Munch does. Let me see, another question. Barbara here from Berkeley. You mentioned an early love experience that Munch had. I understood that he had painful relationships with several women. Can you clarify? Yes, this is something that is quite well known. And Munch never married, and he didn't have any children, but we do know that he had quite a few relationships with women. And one of the very first intense relationships was with a woman who was married, and that he met and had a relationship with, and they went for walks in Oskarstrand, which is near his house, or in that area where he bought a house later. But it couldn't really go any further since she was married, and she was a little bit older than him. So it was a very painful experience, although it was quite intense for him. And then, of course, the most famous relationship was with the woman called Tulla Larsen from 1898 till 1902, and it's very well known, partially because it ended quite dramatically with a gunshot in September of 1902, where they had a fight, and we don't really know who fired the gun, but there was a gun there present in the house when they had their discussion, and it went off at some point, and the bullet hit Munch's middle finger on his left hand, and had to be, or it was fairly badly injured, and it didn't really heal properly, so that for the rest of his life, Munch sort of hit his hand like this. And if you look at photographs of Munch after 1902, there are not very many photographs where you can see his left hand, but he sort of clenches his fist to hide the finger. So that was a big trauma for him. And the relationship with Tulla Larsen was very turbulent. Even though they did get engaged, but never married. Okay, we have, well, that's a good question. Don from Jefferson City, thank you for that. At what age did Munch achieve public recognition of his genius, and of what genre is he associated? Well, Munch achieved, well, he didn't really do very well in the beginning. He was recognized by his fellow artists as a very good or a talented young artist, and he did get to go to Paris to study. He got some stipends for that, but he didn't get recognized, and he got laughed at when he exhibited in 1885. He was laughed at by the crowd when they looked at the painting. And in 1892, he exhibited in Berlin for the first time, and the exhibition was a scandal, and it closed after 8 days. So you can say that he wasn't really recognized early on. But over the next few decades, he did achieve a lot of interest. And in 1912, he was included in a big exhibition in Cologne in Germany, where he was given a room to himself to show his work. And this honor was only given to some of the very few more famous or most famous painters of the modern art. And Munch was the only living one, so it was like Cézanne and so on. So this was a turning point, and for Munch, and sort of the recognition. He got recognition for what he had done. And after about that time, he was living in Norway, and he was financially fairly well off, and he sold, or he tried to keep as much as possible, but he did sell off a little bit. But he didn't have to sell his paintings in order to survive financially. And about the genre that Don was asking about, what genre he's associated with. Well, that's also quite interesting because it changes. If you look at some of the early paintings, he is very traditional. When he goes to Paris to study in the late 1880s, early, and then he gets inspired by Impressionists and what's going on in Paris and in France. And you can see that sort of reflected in his work. You can look into his early work as Symbolism, and also, of course, with the Scream, the connection to Expressionism is very clear. And in his later works, he changes again. So he's not one static things. Oh, Art, you're talking about the picture behind me. Yeah, thank you for noticing that as well. And my upside down dog, everybody. This is a Norwegian contemporary painter called Svein Johansen. Okay. Yes, Shelton from Silver Spring. Good question. What is the relationship to Ibsen's play When We Dead Awaken and several Frieze of Life motifs by Munch? Munch had an exhibition at Blomkvist here in Oslo, or it was called back then Christiania, and Ibsen came by, and Munch was very honored and showed Ibsen around. And the story goes that Ibsen was very much taken by the dance of life that was shown. And later he wrote When We Dead Awaken. And Munch felt he had, that he had a little bit of a part in inspiring Ibsen to write that play. So that's the story. We don't know if this is the case, but this is how Munch has conveyed the story. Let's see. Oh yeah, there's another one here about Ibsen and the Frieze of Life. Thank you for that. Wow, I'm impressed. Gordon, also from Louisville, asks about that relationship, whether there is a relationship in the works of Ibsen and the Frieze of Life. So, good. And we have Joe from Carrboro. in the early 20th century, which of his contemporaries did he interact with? It's a good question, because a lot of artists, and like when you think about the German expressionists, they collaborated quite a bit, and Munch didn't do this. Munch had other artist friends, of course, and he discussed art with his friends. In the 1890s, early 1890s, he most of his friends that he hung out with a lot were writers, not necessarily painters, but he knew of many artists, and he was also very much, or the German expressionists were interested in Munch, and Nolde wanted to meet Munch, which he did, and he was also invited to collaborate, but he never did this really. So in that sense, he didn't really collaborate with other artists, but he did interact with a lot of artists, such as Strindberg, the Swedish playwright, and he was also very much inspired by Max Reinhardt, a theater man director in Berlin. Yeah, so very interesting question, but not a very easy answer for that question, Joe. Good question, Susan. Susan from Austin. I'm just learning about Edvard Munch through your program. Oh, thank you for watching. Could you tell me what his legacy is in the art world? Can you summarize his artistic journey? That's a big question, but I'm going to try and give you an answer. I actually have a Bachelor of Fine Arts from the States, and I remember having to take art history, and Munch was one of the artists that we learned about, actually, and the Vikings. That was sort of the Norwegian part of the curriculum that we had in the introduction to art history classes that I took. And it was interesting to study art history and to see Norwegian art history from the outside. And that Munch was sort of the one artist that was covered. Living here in Norway, the situation is a little bit different. So I find it a little bit different to answer your question, since here in Norway, we have the MUNCH Museum, and he is very much a part of our growing up here, that we learn about him. In Oslo, most schools come and visit the museum every year, and Munch is also one of the artists that is named, saying that you have to learn about Edvard Munch while you are in school. So it's a little bit different. But when I travel abroad, I get very differing reactions about Edvard Munch when I talk about what I work with, and some people don't know his name at all, and then when I say the scream, they light up and understand. So, but he is a central artist, modern artist, from that period around 1900, the decades prior to and after 1900. But as I was mentioned earlier, he wasn't one of those that he didn't collaborate very closely with a group or with another or a group of artists, or and in that way he can't really be connected to a school in the same way. So and he never really made it in Paris, even though he really wanted to. He wanted to be acknowledged in Paris and in the French art world, but he didn't really do that. But he did do really well in Germany. But of course, the Scream is very famous, and in that sense, Munch always will have a place in art history. His artistic journey is that's a big question, Susan. He starts out. There's 5 siblings. He is the second oldest, and his mother dies when he's 5 years old. His father is a doctor, and they're not very rich. And Munch is ill a lot when he's a child, so his schooling is a little bit patchy. He decides early on that he wants to be a painter. This is something he does a lot when he is in bed sick. He draws and paints, and so when he's 16, he writes in his diary, I have decided to become a painter. And pursues this even though his father doesn't approve, because his father wants him to do something where he can make a little bit of money. But he keeps going, and as I said earlier as well, he does get noticed by his fellow artists in the capital here, and he does get stipends early on to go to Paris, and then he also goes to Berlin, and he travels quite a bit until 1908, where he is admitted to a clinic in Copenhagen, and then returns to Norway in 1909 for good, and he stays here until his death in 1944. Let's see another question here. Thank you, Doug from Boston. Are you a Norwegian? I can't hear any accent at all. You sound like someone who grew up speaking American English. Thank you so much. That's a great compliment. As I said, I went to school in the States a long time ago. I did a Bachelor of Fine Arts in Michigan, and I've also lived on Vancouver Island in Canada and in London. So I've spoken English quite a bit. I saw there was a question here also about, let me see, where was that? How I got into my profession. And I have a PhD in art history from the University of Oslo. Before that, I studied art history, also at the University of Oslo, and then graphic design or visual communications in the States. I have worked at the MUNCH Museum for 2 years. So, yeah. And I just want, let's see here. I'll take one more question. Let me see, Jennifer from Chicago here. Oh, thank you for that. You're talking about the series here. Which other series did Munch paint? Well, I mentioned that very briefly in the video in the beginning, but Munch painted quite a few series, and then he also did Alpha and Omega. That is sort of a portfolio of graphic prints. And there's also a series that wasn't completed. It was called The Mirror, which was also graphic prints. So there's the Reinhardt frieze, the Linde frieze, the Frieze of Life that we talked about, and then there's the Green Room series. And the Green Room series is the topic next week. You're gonna see me next week as well, talking about the Green Room series. And this is a group of paintings that's not very well known at all. And I'm very excited to talk about it next time, because that was the topic of my PhD dissertation. So I'm very much looking forward to that. So thank you for watching. As I said, I'll be back next Monday and talk about the Green Room series. See you then.